talking about assuming good intent, there's something really powerful there and something we need more now of. And certainly in the pandemic, where we've seen so much mistrust, at global scale in many cases, there's a lot to unpack there too. So I guess we could pick on number 3, but let's start with see what's invisible, because that just seems like it could be so hard for so many of us. So how do we create a superpower around that?
Yeah, well, and if you want to go back to trust, I will say I'm happy to do so, because you're right. It is kind of the meta, and that could be a conversation in and of itself. Like, it's just, it's so rich and so deep and so difficult, but we have designed so many of our systems from a basic premise of not trusting the average individual, that you should not trust me and I should not trust you. Now, what's interesting, there is a segue from starting with trust to seeing what's invisible. So we can easily go there. And this is probably a nice time to mention too, that these superpowers, they are standalone. You can focus on just one of them and try to get better at just one of them for, a month, a year. You could read one chapter of the book and still benefit. They're designed to be standalone, but they also help to amplify one another. So as you get better at learning how to start with trust, you find it easier to learn how to see what's invisible. And as you learn how to see what's invisible, you get better at knowing you're enough. And as you get better at knowing you're enough, you're able to be all the more human, et cetera, et cetera. So the way I like to put this is that, this is a menu, not a syllabus. You don't have to do number 1 before you can do number 2. Like, you can do 1, 2, 5, or all 8 in any order that you want. But as you do them and dig into them, the others become clearer, not always easier, but you become more aware of how, again, this mindset has been really hijacked. Our mindsets collectively, in many cases, have been hijacked by a range of modern forces that aren't doing as much good these days. And when change hits, that becomes all the clearer. So see what's invisible is a great example of this. And there are lots of ways I could tee this up depending on who I'm talking to. We start to get into, where do you see value, right? This is just one example. I'll talk about value and labor as 2 different examples. Where do you see value? Most people today see value where there are dollar signs. But what about that value, like any kind of parenting or volunteering or a car that's parked idling asset? Like, these are all valuable, but they don't show up in GDP. They're deemed to be sort of latent. And here I'm using a couple different examples, but all of that value, some of the most important value, and let's just talk invisible value, invisible labor. Let's talk for a moment about parenting, about volunteering, about being there for your neighbor. All of those things that we do as humans to show up for one another, which are actually, I would say, the most valuable ways we can spend our time. And yet they're not captured in GDP. That work is not deemed to be worthy of either compensation or note even in our jobs numbers, et cetera, et cetera. And that's really at everyone's collective danger, so to speak. That seeing what's invisible, that's just one example of this invisible labor that is actually the most important kind of work we could possibly be doing. When you see what's invisible and you start making this invisible labor visible, you start treating it with greater respect, greater dignity, greater priorities. It makes us rethink our safety nets. I think here in the United States, we're starting to see a little bit of that right now with some of the reforms that are underway, but it exists everywhere.